Hi, welcome! In this video, I want to talk a bit about the genre of tragedy, how tragedies have changed over time, why we love tragedies, and what the modern tragedy can actually do for us. So, Greek tragedies, the classic tragedies, tell a story of suffering, which is unavoidable and it cannot be changed through human action. It's very often fate-driven or brought about by the influence of gods, and the protagonist will try to fight against their fate, but ultimately find the same downfall no matter what they do. And the purpose of this type of tragedy is to invoke both fear and pity in the viewer, and this is what leads to catharsis, the release of emotion. However, the modern tragedy has changed in several ways, and one of the reasons for this is, interestingly, the distance we have to God, compared to the Greek gods, which were very much involved in people's fates. But today, tragedies are depicted as avoidable, and instead of being a result of divine punishment, they're very often self-inflicted and preventable. And this is already a huge difference because tragedy as a genre usually tells a story of suffering and punishment and downfall, which is foreseeable but unavoidable. And the fact that this has changed, where the modern tragedy is self-inflicted, it is something that we have the power to change and yet we don't, is really interesting. And this is what made me start to think about, well, if the reason for the protagonist's suffering has changed so much, then how has this changed the way we experience catharsis as the audience, as the viewers? So it's something I've been looking into a bit, and it's what I want to talk about in this video, which is that the goal of the modern tragedy still is catharsis, but in a different way. And the shift from classical to modern tragedies has fundamentally changed the way the audience experiences catharsis. So, as I mentioned, in classical tragedies, suffering is inevitable, and it is caused by fate or divine will. You look at characters like Oedipus or Agamemnon, who are struggling against these higher forces that are beyond their own control, and their eventual downfall inspires both pity and fear in us, and this is what leads to that cathartic experience. This is also what gives relief to the audience, because tragedies like this reaffirm that there is a divine order to everything. And even if these punishments may be cruel, they are very much justified and deserved. I recently read the Bacchae, where you can see this really well, because although the punishments and the suffering that the characters go through is cruel, it is very much deserved, at least by the standards of the time, because the idea is that if you honor a god and you pay your respects, they will be your ally. But if you don't respect them, then they will curse your entire bloodline. It's also much easier to recognize what the fatal flaw is in characters that leads them to this downfall. For example, Pentheus is too arrogant and prideful, and he doesn't listen to his father and Tiresias when they tell him that he needs to pay his respect to this new god, and instead he defies them, he goes against this, and this is what leads to his downfall. So then, as a member of the audience, when you are watching this, you can walk away from it and feel pretty confident in yourself, because you will think, okay, I just won't do what he did and I'll be all right. You learn from it. And in ancient Greece, these theaters, performances, they weren't just entertainment, but it was your civil duty to attend, because it was educational. It was supposed to teach you what you're supposed to do and how to be a good, upstanding, moral citizen. So all of these types of classical tragedies, they reaffirm that there is an order to things, and that as long as you behave in the way you're supposed to, you'll be all right, you'll be blessed. But it still subscribes to the idea that your fate isn't in your own hands. Now, on the other hand, modern tragedies depict suffering that is self-inflicted, and even though it is avoidable, it's often inescapable because of human flaws. The actual tragedy in the story is no longer dictated by divine justice or fate, but it is a result of human error. It is a result of societal issues and the absurdity of existence itself. So in modern tragedies, the audience still experiences catharsis, but it may look differently. Instead of the relief you would get from a classical tragedy, from understanding or reaffirming that everything has its place, you may feel a bit more unsettled because it leaves you to reflect on personal responsibility and the role of society in suffering. And oftentimes, because this suffering in modern tragedies is avoidable but is left unresolved, it can leave you with a lingering discomfort instead of the closure that you would get from a classical tragedy. Now, I think Kafka's Metamorphosis can be read as a modern tragedy because while in classical tragedies it is divine will and fate which leads a protagonist to their downfall, however, here, Kligo's downfall is entirely a result of social and psychological issues. This also fits with Arthur Miller's definition of a modern tragedy, a common man destroyed by societal pressures rather than divine will. And I believe this is also why we see tragedies change from focusing only on the most upper classes and nobility to a much wider range of people, because these societal pressures and customs impact so many more people today. So while Greek tragedies offer catharsis through a sense of divine justice or order, Kafka denies this. Kligo's suffering doesn't have any meaning, moral lessons, or resolution. His tragedy is absurd, much like the myth of Sisyphus. He is condemned to a struggle without meaning. And while in a classical tragedy, resolution comes from accepting one's fate, for example, in the Bacchae, we see this in Agave, the mother of Pentheus, who ends up, under illusion, killing her own son. As soon as she realizes this, she is upset, but then she pretty much goes, it is what it is, and she makes her way to go into exile. And as you often see in characters in these tragic plays, they accept their fate. They just go, well, how unlucky we are. This is the God's will. Tough luck. And they move on. But in the modern tragedy, you don't get this resolution. You can only experience catharsis by recognizing the absurdity of it. In this case, Grigor dies and he is discarded. And that's it. That's the end of the story. And this is one of the reasons why the Metamorphosis can feel so disturbing, because it denies this traditional sense of catharsis. In Greek tragedies, the audience will get up and leave with a sense of restored cosmic balance. But after reading the Metamorphosis, all we feel is a bit uncomfortable, at unease, and we realize that suffering may have no meaning at all. So the key difference between the two, classical and modern tragedies, seems to be certainty versus uncertainty. Greek tragedy seems to reinforce a structured cosmos, while modern tragedies seem to leave us questioning if meaning exists at all. This shift in tragedy from divine fate to human responsibility really parallels the modern search for meaning in a world where things like religion, fate, and the gods can no longer provide us with certainty. And this is where spiritual and psychological perspectives can become really interesting. For example, through psychology, catharsis has evolved from merely an emotional purge to a tool for self-reflection and transformation. Greek tragedies allowed the audience to release fear and pity by seeing justice play out, even if it was tragic. It was a cleansing of emotions, and it reaffirmed the whole idea of a cosmic order and balance. Modern tragedies, however, deny any kind of resolution. They force the audience into self-reflection and existential confrontation, where meaning isn't given, but it must be created. Catharsis, then, is no longer just about emotional release. It's about recognizing your responsibility in life, the absurdity of suffering, and the need to create your own meaning. Instead of comforting you, the modern tragedy challenges you. Today, catharsis is no longer about accepting suffering as necessary. It's about recognizing suffering as a mirror, forcing us to confront who we are and what we do about it. So, the modern tragedy's aim is what I will describe as existential catharsis, which, in my opinion, very much mirrors the individuation process, as both involve confronting the fragmented self, integrating suffering, and taking responsibility for the search for meaning. I'll break this down so you can see what I mean when I say this, but basically in Jungian psychology, Individuation is a process of integrating the unconscious aspects of the personality. Its goal is to become whole and to realize and fully develop all these pieces of your true nature. It involves confronting and integrating the shadow, which is the suppressed part of your personality, and it holds all of your fears, insecurities, and limiting beliefs. So, in Jungian psychology, individuation requires facing the shadow, the suppressed and hidden part of the psyche, which contains all of your fears and untapped potentials. Now, in modern tragedies, the tragedy is often self-inflicted. It's a result of the protagonist's own actions or beliefs or will even. And it often leaves us wondering, how did it come to this? Why did it have to end this way if it could have been avoidable? It makes you, as part of the audience, also start to reflect and wonder, what is your role in your own suffering? What part do you play? How are you complicit in it? So just like individuation requires us to confront our own darkness, which holds us back, the modern tragedy leaves us questioning, why has it come to this? For example, in Metamorphosis, we can look at Gregor and recognize all these little flaws that have led to his downfall. And even worse, we can look at the situation and realize that while it may have been avoidable, it was inevitable because nothing was going to change, even if it could have. And there's one interpretation that I quite like. It was by Nabokov, who was a big insect fanatic, I guess. And he had claimed that he identified the bug that was described in the Metamorphosis, so the bug which Gregor had transformed into. And he said that this bug actually had wings and was able to fly. And we also see the significance of the window in his room. So the whole time, the idea that he could have climbed out of the window and flown away. He could have left, he could have been free, and yet this thought never entered his mind because the whole story, and as a person, he is so stuck in doing everything he can to be useful to other people, to be of service to others, to be sacrificed in a way that in this interpretation, even when he has the chance to be free and to escape, he doesn't take it because he doesn't even recognize it. So the situation was maybe avoidable, but as a person, it would have always led to that same downfall. And this is what makes it so sad because he doesn't even try to fight his fate. In fact, he's so confined by his own beliefs, it's bizarre. He wakes up and he's transformed into a bug, and the first thought that crosses his mind is that he's going to be late to work. How will he, with no longer having a human voice, explain this to his boss? And throughout the whole story, he rarely thinks of himself. He's only putting others above him. And while you could call this his fatal flaw, there are so many more layers to it because he cannot break free from his own limitation. And this leads us to the next point in individuation, which we often find in modern tragedies, which is the death of the old self. Think ego death or ego dissolution. Individuation involves a death and rebirth of the self. The old ego, think this is as well your social mask, your roles, your beliefs and illusions must break apart in order for your true and new self to emerge. Modern tragic heroes often experience an ego death, not a literal death, but a shattering of their self-concept. And an example that comes to mind for this is actually Steppenwolf by Hermann Hesse. And while I think you can argue a lot whether Steppenwolf can be read as a modern tragedy, as he comes very close to this true transformation or individuation, in fact there's so many parallels there, in one of the final scenes it is suggested that even after he has this knowledge and he realizes he can change, he goes back to his old ways. But still, he has that moment where his old Steppenwolf self-image is shattered, and he is freed from the restraints of his own mind, which mirrors individuation, where one must abandon illusions and face psychological disintegration in order to become whole. And finally, while Greek tragedy provides closure, for example, in that the gods dictate fate and suffering has a meaning because everything happens according to a greater cosmic order, modern tragedy removes this, mirroring the existential burden of creating one's own meaning. Jung, for instance, argued that meaning is not given. It must be individually created through deep self-awareness. Just like how modern tragedies deny this resolution, forcing the audience to confront their own existential questions. What is worth living for? What is the purpose of life and suffering? Is there free will? And if so, what are we even supposed to do? I mean, just think of some of the books I've discussed on this channel. Modern Man in Search of a Soul, Man's Search for Himself, Man's Search for Meaning. All this is the response to the modern tragedy. It is finding meaning in suffering. And that is not something that can be given to you, it's something that must be created individually. And this is exactly what Jung has once described as the crisis of modernity. As Nietzsche's saying goes, God is dead, and suffering can feel meaningless, yet we still seek meaning in it. So modern tragedy acts like a psychological initiator, a lot like individuation. Instead of offering divine resolution, it forces the audience into the same existential reckoning as the protagonist. Its catharsis then comes not from some external resolution, but from recognizing that suffering is an internal and transformative process, just as individuation is. Just think of any tragic novels or modern plays that have had a big impact on you. How have they changed you? How have they changed the way you look at the world and you think and you see yourself? I know for me, when reading a tragedy, it can affect me for days or even weeks. And just recently, I finished reading Han Kang's The Vegetarian, and I have not been able to stop thinking about it since then. It has put so many questions in my mind about what it means to be human, the inherent violence in humanity, and suddenly I find myself confronted with all these thoughts and questions, even though I was only the reader. And this is exactly what I mean with existential catharsis. For example, you read the Bakai and you walk away from it thinking, sure, that was a bit violent, but I guess he deserved it. And then you read the Metamorphosis and you just feel devastated and a bit confused. You feel so unsettled and you're left questioning, why did it have to come to this? Why did this happen? Was there no other way? Why didn't he prevent it if he could have? The modern tragedy encourages you to self-reflect, to recognize your role in your own suffering, and to create your own meaning in life. It acts as a psychological wake-up call that prompts you to change yourself, or better, to transform yourself, which is the same goal as individuation. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I really hope this makes sense. These were just some of the thoughts that have been going around my head lately, and I hope that, if anything, sharing this might lead to some interesting discussions. I really would love to hear your thoughts on this in the comments, and I'll see you next time. Bye!